So welcome to today's library webinar. I'm going to try and attempt to answer the question of, can I use this in my assignment? So what we're going to have a look at here is some various types of resources and some of the questions you might like to ask yourself before you actually do use it in your course as part of your assessment task. But first up, what I'd like to do, and I'll ask Ben because I can no longer see them, would you mind launching a couple of poll questions that we've got to kick off today? So the idea of this is just to give us a little bit of an idea as to how, what you might what your experiences with webinars are and how confident you feel with your actually evaluating resources. So if you'd like to answer those couple of questions, and we will allow a minute or so for people to do that and see if we get most people having a go. And then I've got another open-ended question for you to think about in relation to that. Well, so we've got a few first timers. Good to see. I'm hoping that you will answer the question for you this afternoon or this morning. Okay, I think that's most people who are here at the moment. So what we might do is, so the results show that we've got 3 newcomers to the library webinar, so welcome. And then there's a mix of people in terms of the level of confidence. There's a few that aren't so confident. A few are sitting on the fence, and that's okay, I understand that. And there's a couple that are. So hopefully even the couple that are, you might pick up a few little hints and tips and tricks this afternoon or this morning. Okay. So what I'd like to do is in the chat session, would you mind answering the question? If you want to, you don't have to. What do you hope to get out of this session? And I'll ask Ben to share some of those comments, not your names, just the comments that are made in terms of that. What are you hoping to get out of this session? And I'll hope that I might answer some of these, or I can add a few comments here and there as we go through this morning. I'll give you a minute or so to answer that. And you don't have to if you don't wish to. All quiet on the chat front, is it, Ben?
We've got a shy bunch.
No, that's okay. That's fine. I can live with a shy bunch. That's not a problem. So let's wander on and we'll start to have a bit of a chat about this stuff. Okay, so what I'm going to look at this morning, sorry, I keep thinking it's afternoon for some reason. We're going to have a look at some resource types. So we're both all on the same page. We're going to have a look at some tools that you can use that you may be aware of currently that are available. We're going to have a look at TRAP, which has its role, but there's a few things that doesn't quite answer. So for example, how does TRAP work with internet stuff? Maybe, maybe not. Might be a few other things that we need to have a bit of a look at, and where you might get some more help if you want to, you need some more information. Okay, so in terms of some of the resource types, the books, the journals, yeah, pretty common, pretty standard. What I really want to more focus on, I'll make a few comments about the top 2, but what I want to look at later on in the webinar is things like, how do we work out whether social media is any good, some of the content on that. Websites, particularly useful. What about podcasts and webinars? There's lots of those after the last 12 to 18 months. We've got heaps out there. What about infographics? And one last one, which is can be a very interesting thing, is data. What questions should we ask about the data that we're using in terms of some of these types of resources? And then, do they work with our assignments? Do we need to be aware of some bits and pieces with that? Okay, so in terms of the tools, what I'd like to have a look at first, and this applies to both books and journal articles, is in your databases. So if you hook into any of the databases, what you'll find after you do your search, so this is the results of a search, is that down the left-hand side, generally, sometimes they're presented a little bit differently, but often in a lot of the more common databases that we see, so EBSCO, ProQuest, They have some tools down the side that can be really, really helpful. So the image on the left is simply a screenshot of, I just did a search, and this is what I've got before I even think about limiting it. I tend to keep my searches fairly broad, and then we'll come through and refine them. So it means you actually get something to refine in the first place. So really quite helpful that way. So my search yielded 83,000 results, and I went, even a nerdy librarian like me isn't going to read that much. So let's get organized a bit. So what I did down there before I started to read anything was click on things like full text, which is kind of helpful if you've left your assignment a little bit to the last minute. You can request articles, but please be aware it can take a little bit of time for that to come through. And with lockdown at the moment and database licensing and that sort of stuff, it's not always straightforward to get things. So please don't leave things to the last minute. If you have kind of left them a little bit late, that's not a bad way to go. Because what you'll find is an abstract isn't always enough to base your assessment task on. The next thing I always click on is the scholarly or peer-reviewed journals, which is really important because in some databases, I tend to find the business ones are a classic for this. I might have had 83,000 results to start with, but what I tend to find is that it disappears. I tend to lose quite a lot of results that way, simply by clicking on that. The next thing I do is I call it putting out the trash. So often we look at the last 5 years. Sometimes it might be relevant to look a little bit further back, but you want the more current stuff. So on the left, my database looks at from 1910, which is more than 5 years ago. So the one on the right, I brought it up to sort of 2015, 2016. And then the last thing I've clicked on for this particular screenshot is actually looking at academic journals. So actually trying to weed it down to just simply those. When I've clicked on all of those, the cumulative result is I've gone from 83,300 to 5,500. Heck of a lot better, a lot less daunting in terms of what you actually find. Further down on those screens, if you were to scroll down a little bit further on the databases, often they will then give you more options. So things like you can check for subjects, you might be able to check for location as well, if that's a particular element that you have to consider for your assessment task. So there are more options. This is just a starting point from that side. So please use these sort of tools. They can be quite helpful in terms of answering some of the questions that we'll cover in a sec. The other one I wanted to show you quickly was library search, and you can do the same thing with it. The big difference to remember between library search and the databases that I just showed you is that library search is drawing from a broader range of sources in terms of it might be drawing from a lot more different types of databases, whereas if you get into a single database, often it's somewhat more limited in terms of its content. You can do the same thing here. So on the left, I did the same search and I ended up with 12 million results. And this nerdy librarian is definitely not going to try and read 12 million results on that front. A few clicks. So looking at, again, full text online. So in case I left it a little bit late, the peer-reviewed option and the journal article option here, among other things. And you can, again, further refine that down. So I went from 12 million to a bit under 900,000 results. Again, a way to make things a little more manageable. So please use those tools, and you can do the same thing for books. And a lot of the book databases or those sort of things, you can do exactly the same sort of stuff. You can look at things like date as well, and those things to actually draw it down and make things a little bit more narrow for you in terms of your search. Okay, so the next thing I'd like to have a look at is for those particular things, and often we do use the monogram of TRAP. So it's looking at timeliness. So for example, when was the item published? Has it been updated? So a classic one with that is often our textbooks. Things do change, and so that we get a new edition out. So what you want to look for in that situation is making sure you've got the latest edition, because things do change and it's not always obvious to pick up what has changed in terms of content. The next one is relevance. Is it appropriate to use? Does it actually answer the question? What is its intended audience? Is it a bit more academic, or is it something that's more general knowledge, that sort of stuff? Might need to work out whether the content that you're looking at is that good. The next one is authority. And when we're talking about this, we're looking at, who is the author? Who do they work for? Is it peer reviewed in terms of the journal articles? Can you find out a little bit more information about the author in terms of what their qualifications are, what they've done, who they work for? Next, the other A is accuracy. So looking for obvious errors. So when you're looking at something, does it look like it's kind of being cut and pasted together? The days of being able to do that and get away with it are definitely long gone. So having a look at that sort of aspect. When they're talking about stuff, do they provide evidence to back up what they're doing? So can you actually then, could you go and check that information somewhere else? They're not just stating a fact and then walking away and leaving it. Say, for example, a statistic of 20% of something or other. So where they got the 20% figure from, that sort of thing. And the last one is purpose. So why was it written in terms of that? Is there a level of bias in it? Does it look at both sides of a debate or an argument, or is it just looking at one particular aspect? And does it have an agenda? Some things can be quite, I guess, pushing an agenda, which may or may not be answer your question and may cause other issues for you if you need to look at an issue more broadly. So this is what we, I guess, in terms of commonly used for resource evaluation, but I'm not totally convinced all the time that it actually helps with some stuff. And certainly, I mean, it's very easy if the content is largely fixed. So in a hard copy book, a PDF journal article, a little bit harder to change, not impossible, but a little bit harder to change. But then the $1 million question comes up, as I mentioned earlier, what about social media, websites, things that can actually be changed by people at any point in time? How do we work out whether that's the content on that is any good? Mega good question. Before I go on to talk about this, just asking Ben whether there's any questions in the chat. So if anyone's added anything that I would like to cover before I move on.
Nothing at the moment, but yeah, feel free to add any questions to the chat.
All righty. Thank you much, Lee. Okay. So in terms of some of the other tools we might like to think of, and they've been covered a little bit so far, we might like to look at a bit more about the author. We also might want to check the affiliation of the author. Check out the institution. So who is it that they're working for, or who is the website organizer? Also, we want to check the date. We want to check the website in terms of that. And we also might like to check the claims that are being made as part of the, within the article or on the website itself. Actually see whether we can find the same information somewhere else. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to have a bit of a look at is, I guess, the use of online media, in particular news media. So I found an article here, and it's off a website called The Conversation, which we'll get into in a sec. The title of the article is, "You may have heard the moon wobble will intensify coastal floods." Well, here's what it means for Australia. Okay, so the first question I've got here, I'm just going to crawl on to the actual site itself. So here is the actual article here. Apologies for the scroll, I need to go down a little bit, that sort of thing. So the first question I've got is, would I even consider using this article for my assignment, which happens to be looking at coastal problems in Australia that could be coming? So the first thing I'd like to have a bit of a look at is the organisation, or in this case, the website. So I'm looking at here the Conversation. So let's have a look at here, and what I want to find out first is to see whether I can actually work out whether this is a particularly good website. So this website here that I've just got onto. So it's Media Bias Fact Checked. What we can do here is actually check in and see whether the article itself is of any, or the organisation, sorry, to start with, is of any good. Okay, so what we want to have a look at here. Come on. And I want to put in The Conversation. Okay, rightio. So on this particular website, it will actually give me some unbiased information about the particular organisation. Alrighty, so if I scroll down a little bit here, it's basically saying not at all biased on this scale here. The factual reporting is very high, so looking good so far. If I scroll down just a fraction further, these sources have minimal bias and use very few loaded words. So in terms of emotional type words that might create a reaction. Okay, so if I scroll down just a fraction further, it goes it's least biased, the factual reporting is very high, it's a website and it's got high credibility. So the first thing, if I come back to my article, is I go, I'd give the website a tick. Yippee, she's pretty good. The next thing I'd like to have a look at is if I scroll down here, the next thing I want to find out is whether Mark Gibbs actually works for the Australian Institute of Marine Science. So let's open myself another tab here and we go Mark Gibbs and see what I get. Okie dokie, this top one looks reasonably good. Let's see if I can get in and have a bit of a look and just see whether it stacks up. Okay, so Marine Institute Science, fabulous, Mark Gibbs, that looks pretty good. If I come back, the other thing I'm going to do is check out his photo. Not that I can see that very clearly, but it looks kind of similar. So that's quite good. So if I scroll down here a little bit and see, he's been there for a little bit of time. He's also worked in for some other organisations. Okay, there's 2 ticks for me in terms of the organisation that. You also might like to check in terms of the disclosure statements. They sort of, sometimes there's funding involved with things, so you might like to sort of check that sort of stuff out. Okay, so far I've ticked the box. I feel pretty happy that this is a fairly good website. The guy stacks up. The next thing I do now is have a little bit of a read of some of the bits in the actual article to sort of see what's going on. So the first paragraph just looks at some of the history. I mean, and if you've been watching the news, you'll know that China's been hit by bad floods and parts of Europe also got done in the last couple of weeks. But I guess what where it's coming from is in terms of then relating that to a study that was done by NASA. So, and any of these links will actually take you through to the actual site, and I've actually opened that up here. Okay, so looking at some of the facts that they've used here, if I scroll down a little bit, what they're saying in here, when you read down a little bit further, is that the moon basically is its orbit changes, and when the orbit changes, that's what affects the tides across the world. And so things are going to become more problematic for some parts of the world. And there's some parts of Australia that are going to have hassles that way. All right, so that looks pretty good. They're actually drawing from the NASA site, which is a credible website. It's a credible organisation. So if we want to know, okay, so what's going on, they're talking about here in Australia. So if I scroll down just a bit further, what I will find, they're talking a bit about how the relationship with the moon and how that works. And then if I get onto the link here for Australia, this then explains here why we have such a huge tidal difference, low tide and high tide around Australia. This has come out of the Met Bureau, which is an Australian government organisation that actually does all the weather reporting here. And it also here explains too why we've got such wide tidal ranges vary from place to place, and therefore be able to work out what's actually going to happen in terms of bits and pieces that way. So thinking, okay, so this is looking pretty good. So I've checked my claims. I'm fairly happy that this would actually go. And then it actually gives you some examples in Australia about some in between. I get both types of examples. Some things that, for example, here in Derby, which has a lower population, they'll see some impacts, but there's also some highly populated areas such as around Melbourne and Sydney and some of the other capital cities that are going to actually have some pretty big impacts. So I'm thinking pretty good. I like the thought of using this particular article in an assessment task. I'd be quite happy and feel quite comfortable that it's putting the facts on the table. I've checked out where things have come from. I've gone back to see where the sources are, which have come off websites and those sorts of things, which is really, really good. Alrighty. One question that can arise is that while my fact check Bias Fact Check website is fabulous for some bits and pieces. There might be other organisations or websites that you kind of get in to look at and you go, doesn't actually have anything. One I'm thinking about in particular is some of the think tanks, because they often do provide information in terms of you might like to consider in that. So how the heck do you find out about those? Wikipedia is very helpful in that sense. So if I have a look for one of the, it's only one of the think tanks in Australia, the Australia Institute. So if we have a bit of a look at those, right, okay, so I found something on the Australia Institute website that they do podcasts, reports, webinars, a whole range of information that's could be quite interesting, that is quite interesting, and also you might consider using as part of your assessment task. Because they're not a media website necessarily, they don't always, that sort of stuff doesn't always come up. So your next best option is to have a look at not their website, because they're only going to tell you what they want you to hear. What you want to have a look at is a website that basically just puts the story on the table. And that's where Wikipedia can actually come in quite helpful. So here I've just simply, you can just Google the Australia Institute and you can just add Wikipedia to the end of that entry and you'll get the same outcome as this. So on here, what I'm looking for is a bit of an idea as to how long they've been around. The Australian Institute's been around since 1994. So they've been around for quite a while. That's nearly 30 years. They're not that far off it. They're a public policy think tank and they've got a website. So, and then you can go through here and it actually tells you a little bit about what they do. And the interesting thing about this particular one is they tend to be, they might be a little bit leaning towards one way because they do support a lot of like Labor Party and the unions, which when you look at their content makes a little bit of sense. But then again, you know that, so you can then make a decision as to whether this stuff is any good to do that. So it then goes on to tell you a little bit about the research and the actual areas that they look at covering. So their interests are in climate and energy. They've also got the Centre for Future Work and the tax reform debate, as well as a couple of the big issues that they look to cover. So if I did come across some of their stuff, it might be worth a look at, and you might also then look at some of the other, to see the other side of the debate with some of these types of issues. So really important to have a look at that. The other thing too that you want to have a look at and try and see if you can find out with anything along these lines is where they get their money from. So in this sort of, for the Australia Institute, basically they are independently funded by donations from philanthropic trusts and individuals, and as well as grants from and commission research from business, unions and non-government organisations. And the interesting thing to note is the Australia Institute does not accept donations or commission work from political parties. So while they might lean towards some stuff, they don't take any money from that. So you just want to find out a little bit of background about the organisation when they're putting up sort of ideas and that sort of stuff to make sure that things are credible. I would do the same approach. If you're using a blog, I would check out who the author is, who they work for, that sort of stuff, and I would very much check their claims. A lot of this stuff is really, really good for ideas, and that's what you might use it as a starting point to base your assessment task on. You may not actually end up referencing any of this stuff. You might go, oh yeah, okay, let's explore that particular concept in the literature. So you might go back to the databases and use some of the ideas you're finding here as part of your assessment task instead. The big thing about you need to remember about the databases is it can take a while for things to get published. So I'm just thinking, certainly if the issue that you're looking at has potentially been impacted by COVID, you may have little or no choice but to look at some of the more current content on websites such as this, purely because while we're starting to see articles and that come through in not so much, I mean, the medical stuff's come through pretty quickly, but in other types of areas, you may still need to get some of these things just to simply get enough information. Alrighty, is there any questions about this element to date?
No, we're good.
We're good. Alrighty, let's go back and continue with my bits and go from here. Okay. So the other thing I wanted to mention was a quick comment about data. So, I mean, to me, I'd also use the same approach for podcasts and also for social media. So finding out who they are. A lot of this stuff can be, as I said, really good for ideas, but I would go through and check the credibility of stuff. And in particular with Twitter, 140 characters is great as a, I guess, as a draw card, but often again, the details aren't sufficient. So I would actually click through any links and check out the full post or the link that they're taken to. And that's what I would reference in my assessment task, not so much the tweet or anything along those lines, because you probably won't find enough detail. So go through, and it's actually the item itself that you need to reference. But again, pardon me, do your homework before you actually make that final decision on whether you want to use it or not. The one comment I'd like to make about this list on the screen at the moment is the bottom one about data. As the saying goes, it can be lies, damn lies, and statistics. Data can be manipulated in terms of that to present one side of a debate or an argument. So please be careful and investigate a little bit about the data that you might be considering using, especially, for example, if it's a survey. If they've said they've surveyed, say, 2,000 people as a representative proportion of a population on this question, how big is that original population? If it's 2,000 people for 20 million, is that representative or not? You need to have a bit of a look at that sort of stuff, because data can actually misrepresent outcomes and that sort of thing. If it's collected data, say something on the ABS website, so things like employment data, that sort of thing, gross domestic product, consumer price index, they've got ways and means of collecting that sort of data, and it's a little bit more robust, and you can actually read behind how they do actually collect that. Some of the other stuff can be a little bit harder. Certainly some of the surveys can be a little bit harder to find out about stuff. Because the thing too is, if you've ever been stuck answering a survey, do you actually answer all the questions? So how many questions do they need to answer in their survey before they actually use that data point as part of the results? So please ask a few questions about it and be a little bit curious about how they came to their conclusions. I guess a classic example where data was creatively used, you could say, was when they got rid of the carbon tax when Tony Abbott was in office. They claimed that they used data to claim that the tax was having no impact in terms of reducing carbon emissions in Australia, which wasn't actually true. So if you actually go back and have a look at the data. So there's quite a number of examples over the years of that sort of thing, people creatively or narrowly using information, data information to push an argument. So please put your detective hat on. So I'd like to draw us back to the beginning about where we started, and can I use this in my assessment task? Well, I make the comment, that's a good question. In the long run, it's your assessment task. Suggest that you ask a lot of questions about some of the information that you might use, certainly the stuff that isn't quite so easy to filter, so you can't get the peer-reviewed stuff like you can in journals and that sort of stuff. But in the long run, the decision to use it comes down to you. I'm not saying don't use it, but what you might like to do, if you do find it has a bias or an agenda or something along those lines, you might like to state that in your assessment task clearly, so that you can explain to your lecturer or the tutor who's marking it that you understand that the information that you are using only covers this aspect of things. And you might say that there are more aspects to this debate, but given I guess the length of words that you've got to play with, or whatever the debate or the argument that you want to put up, or the side of the issue that you want to explain, that's what you're doing. So the big thing is just to understand what's behind some of the information, and in the long run, you have to make that decision as to whether you would like to use it or not. If you'd like some further help in terms of working your way through some of this sort of stuff, there is some information on the library website, and we're currently developing a tool to help you answer a lot of these questions, which will have some further examples in it and an opportunity for you to have a look at something and come to your own conclusions. The other option you've got is always to book a librarian. Happy to sit down and have a look at stuff with you, or help you find some more information in terms of that. So to finish off with, if there's any questions, please put them in the chat. And the other question I'd like to ask you more generally is, how will you use the information that you have learned in this session? Can you please add any comments to the chat? And we'll also launch the second poll as well, so that people can answer that, if you wouldn't mind, Ben, please. Oh, goody. A few people are a bit more confident. I guess the big thing to me is it's questioning stuff. It's not necessarily totally believing everything you ever see. So please don't be scared to question things. Oh, goody. And it's also going to be beneficial for your studies. That's great. I'm glad that we've picked a topic that is relevant and resonating with a few people. So do we have any questions? Still got a quiet bunch?
Still very quiet. But like you said, Nicole, if anybody does have any follow-up questions, they can ask the library, book a librarian, and get in contact with us that way.
Yep.
Kim says it's very interesting and informative and lots to think about. And she thanks you, Nicole.
No, thank you, Kim. I know what you mean. There's a lot to think about when you start to question or start to ask questions about things. And there's just so much information out there now. In the last 12 months, it's just exploded. The webinars, the podcasts, the fact that we've been stuck at home and you can't go to things as easily or readily anymore or as much. People have put a lot more stuff online. So yeah, there's some good stuff out there. Yeah.
Yes, Konstantin has asked, can you use Wikipedia for basic facts?
I'd still be a little bit careful. I mean, I'd use it as potentially some background reading for myself, but if you need to, thinking about if it needs to be referenced, I would see if you could find something a little more academic as an academic source. So it may even be a textbook, just if you need to define a particular thing, or there might be something in a journal article that you could use instead. The way I used Wikipedia today, I wouldn't reference that. I was just getting some background information on the organisation that I was looking at. So I wouldn't reference that. I would just get that information in the back of my mind and go, yep, they're okay. They don't take money from this, but they do like the Labor Party. Okay, so just being a bit careful about, I might try and find some other stuff that looks at some of the other side of politics or some of the other policies or options that are available. Does that help you out, Konstantin?
Yes, thank you.
Because the big thing about Wikipedia and a lot of the stuff on the web, and why I say that, is it can be edited by anyone. So you're not quite sure as to whether someone's tweaked something in the last 12 hours, 24 hours, week, or something along those lines. And it can be a bit hard to, unless you want to go checking, to find out what's actually happened. So that's the challenge with this stuff that's fairly fluid. Hard copy stuff's a little hard to change unless you want to go through and change every single copy of a textbook in the world. It's a little less challenging, I guess.
And Wikipedia is not always completely up to date. So those basic facts might be, 5 years old or so.
Yeah. That was one of the questions, or one of the things that we did raise, was the timeliness of anything. So you need that is an important element to check. One comment, it was quite interesting. I've been listening to some podcasts as part of developing the tool up in the last little while, and it was interesting to listen to some, and they actually put a disclaimer at the end and go, this podcast was recorded on such and such a date, and as a result, content or situation may have changed at this point in time, which I thought it's a lovely warning in terms of saying some of the government position might change, but in terms of how they define some of the elements within it possibly haven't. So you just have to pick and choose what you would use out of something along that sort of line. So, but a lot of the webinars, I've never heard that mentioned in those. This was just a particular set of podcasts that I was looking at. So you just need to be a little careful. Yeah. Well, if there's no more questions, then we might wrap him up for this morning, but please don't be strangers. If you've got any queries, please get in touch and we'll endeavour to help you out where we can. So thank you very much for coming along this morning. I appreciate the attendance and the questions that I got, and yeah, good luck with your assessment tasks, and no doubt we'll hear from you soon, hopefully.
Thanks, Nicole.